Now it is my pleasure to introduce Anne Treadaway, who will serve as our presenter. First, a big thank you to Anne for joining us. Anne is an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Iraq. As the director of Rutgers University's Office of Veteran and Military Programs and Services, she is responsible for the development and coordination of a comprehensive program of support services for student veterans at all 3 campuses of the university. Anne also serves as the principal advocate for student veterans, ensures the quality of policies, programs, and activities, and services designed to enhance their educational experiences, and also serves as the university's liaison with outside agencies and offices whose work impacts the lives of student veterans. Anne received her bachelor's degree from SUNY Purchase and her master's degree from CUNY Staten Island. She recently earned her doctorate in education from Northeastern University, successfully defending her thesis on a topic closely aligned to that of today's webinar. Anne, I'd like to hand things over to you, and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to start with a question. Margaret will share a poll. Has anyone served who's joined us in the armed forces? I'm going to keep going while the poll's going on. So in 2010, according to the census, 9.3% of our population over the age of 18 had served in the armed forces in the United States. Fast forward to 2019, when they're collecting data for the 2020 census, that dropped down to 6.8%. But when we talk about those who have served since the events of September 11th, 2001, that's even significantly smaller. It's half of 1%. And as you can see from this next graph, right, participation in the military has declined over years. During World War II, almost 9% of the country's population served in the military. And now, in addition to 9%, almost 9% serving, you also had women going to work, you had victory gardens, you had rationing. All right, there's another instance of our country being attacked and how involved the population was in that conflict, right? So a good chunk of people serving and a good chunk of people supporting overall mission. But when you fast forward to the post 9/11 conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, it goes down to half of 1%. And so we can see from the poll as well, the majority, 83% of those participating today have not served in the military. So I like to also ask, this will be the next poll question, if you haven't served, or even if you have, are you directly related to someone who served in the military? Now, this data is about a decade old. Pew Research hasn't asked this question again, so it's probably even less, right? People who were related. But what they found is when they asked people over the age of 50, 77% of adults over 50 indicated that they were directly related to someone who had served in the military. And as we go down in age, right, adults between 30 and 49, it dropped to 57%. And then 18 to 29, it dropped to 33%. Now, again, this is a decade old, and I would argue that that 33% is even less now. So your age also has a lot to do with whether you're directly related to someone who served in the military. And you can kind of see from the poll as well that very few people, right? Oh, a lot of people actually are related directly.
I think in our case, we have a lot of engaged people on the line.
Always good to know. So throughout this session, this education session, I want you to think of, what is it that you think of those who serve, the military, their families, and how are those opinions formed? Now, since we did have a lot of participants who are directly related, it probably came from, that relationship. That's how you have an understanding about the military and their families. But for others, usually what people think of when they think of veterans is they think of older white men, with the funny hats and outside the supermarket with the poppies, right? This is usually the image most people have of when we think of veterans. They don't think of minorities. They don't often think of women. And we don't think of the LGBTQ population. So veterans often, especially in a college campus, can go unnoticed. They blend in. right? They might look a little older than the traditional student, but for the most part, they're not in what most people imagine a veteran to look like. So I did my dissertation and my research on military cultural competency and education, but I'm not the only one who has sessions like this, which we're doing today. In 2013, Purdue also does veteran ally training. And what they found was that most of the participants had minimal interactions with veterans through their work, and that most of the assumptions about the military and veterans in general were obtained through the media. And that makes sense. If very few serve and very few people are related to someone who serve, where are you going to get your idea of the service? So let's look at headlines, right? Headlines often, veteran or military is usually the top identifier for individuals. So you can see that, if you Googled veterans right now because of Veterans Day just recently passing, you'd probably get more positive stories, unlike the violent headlines I just showed you, or when it comes to women and depression, right? Also, a lot of stories about sexual assault. Or you get the other side, right? You get the veterans who are heroes. Right? Or more recently, since the combat exclusion for women has ended, you get a lot of headlines of women breaking in the military. It's called the brass ceiling, right? Instead of the glass ceiling, and in participating in areas in service that they were never allowed to participate in before. So since few Americans serve in the military, and few, depending on your age, right, are directly related to someone who served, a lot of what we understand from the military comes from the media. And so I just showed you some headlines that are really extreme, right? There's either a very violent, right, and then direct connection that violence is related to their military service, or heroism, right? And that heroic acts are directly related to their military service. So the media's portrayal of military and military service sensationalizes these two extremes. The same thing happens in fictional, in movies. Hollywood often, you see in World War II movies, it's the triumphant citizen soldier, a country rallying behind a cause, or Vietnam era films, right, which is more of the disillusionment with war. So again, these are just very extreme, over sensationalizing the extreme aspects of war and the outcomes of war. So again, if you haven't served and you're not directly related to someone, where are our opinions formed and what do we think of those who do serve? So this was a more recent Pew Research poll from 2019. And people were asked, do these attributes, right, are they more common in those veterans, or are they common, right, in anyone? Military service has nothing to do with them. So you can see, when veterans are asked, they think that those who serve are more disciplined, right? That attribute is much more inclined towards those who serve. But it's still pretty close, right? All adults say, no, it doesn't, military service has nothing to do with that. So these all remain pretty close, but the ones I wanted to focus in on are the bottom half, right? So those who served, veterans, when asked, which better describes those who have served, tolerant is how veterans view themselves, right? We're more tolerant than those who haven't served. But the general public, right, you can see 47 to 19. Independent thinker, those who served much more think that service relates to, that aspect, right? Civilians, 19. And you keep going down, and prone to violence, right? So 9% of the veterans who participated in this poll said no, that service doesn't describe those, to be that are more prone to violence, whereas civilians is 21. And we're getting that idea again from those headlines, from media, because we're not getting it from someone who directly served, and we don't see it in our own families. So again, this is part of that original Pew Research from a decade ago, but it still holds very true. When asked, veterans indicated, and those who had served, that the public did not understand problems faced by those in the military or their families. And the majority of the public, those without a military background, agreed that they didn't understand. So the goal of today's session is that we are trying to create a culture of support, right? And you can create a culture of support by understanding certain aspects of the military, certain aspects of the veteran population. And that connection is how you make a more welcoming environment for those who served in the military, who are currently serving, and their families. So I want you to keep in mind that some of the misconceptions, like I've shown you, that could be created based off of those headlines, that maybe veterans or those who serve are more likely to suffer from mental health issues, or are more likely to be violent. Those misconceptions create stigmas, and those can have an impact on the interactions with people who have served in the military or even their families. So warfare and consequences. I have a degree in history, so I have to have this slide in there because I spent that much time on early American Republic. So if you can see from early conflicts in American history, the longest happened to be the Revolutionary War at 8.4 years, right? Seconded to Vietnam, which was 8.1 years. But if we include the most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, you can see 19.5 and 16. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were engaged in the longest period of sustained warfare in American history, right? It's more than double what previous length of war we had been engaged with before. Those lines, the 13 and 9 years, those are where official combat operations end. So we all remember last August, American troops pulling out completely from Afghanistan. So we had been there, right, since 2001 on, but the combat operation ended in 2014. In Iraq, combat operations ended in 2011, but we still maintained a presence. So in previous conflicts, right, this is killed in action. I usually ask, sometimes if this is live, why would the Civil War have had so many casualties? And to answer that, besides medical treatment being very poor at the time, we're also fighting ourselves, right? There's no one else involved in that conflict. We're fighting ourselves. So you can see over time that the casualties of war starts to get smaller and smaller. And I've just explained that this was the longest period of sustained warfare, right, American history, but you can see that the killed in action in Iraq and Afghanistan are relatively low. And there's a reason for that. Healthcare has improved. Our protection, body armor, bulletproof vests, our vehicles, all those things have improved. We're not in trench warfare where we're fighting directly at each other or shooting directly at each other in lines. You don't have, you have access to medical care. I think the average time during Iraq and Afghanistan ended up being around 13 minutes to get to a field hospital. So an injury that was likely to have killed you during Vietnam, you're more likely to live with. Right? So when you look at the chances of being killed versus the chances of being wounded in action, you go back to World War II, and it's not 50-50, but it's relatively close, right? You're just as likely to be killed in action as you are to be wounded in action. Whereas you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, you're much more likely to sustain a service-connected injury and to live with that injury, right, than be killed in action. Now, again, longest period of sustained warfare. So about 1 in 5 veterans today served on active duty after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. Their collective experiences from deployment to combat to transition back to civilian life are markedly different from those who had served in previous eras. The reason I share that too is those who said yes regarding being directly related to someone who had served, if that veteran happens to be a World War II veteran or a Vietnam veteran, right? It's a different generation of veterans. The nature of combat has changed, right? Every generation of veterans had a different experience, were exposed to different things, and that makes a difference, right? It makes a difference in how we interact with those veterans and talk to them. If you look at World War II, those veterans were welcomed back, right? And again, that's more triumphant, how we think of World War II, the greatest generation. And when we think of Vietnam, the transition back for those veterans was difficult. They weren't welcomed back in the same way. So not only their experiences in combat, but also the way that they are received when they come home, very different. And now post 9/11 veterans, right? Those happen to be very visible, right? So it's a very different experience than the welcome home of Vietnam veterans. Now, post 9/11 veterans were more likely to have been deployed, seen combat, experienced emotional trauma. The difference between previous generations of veterans as well is the amount of deployments. As Margaret had pointed out, I deployed twice, but we have had students who have deployed up to 9 times. So the nature of deployments has changed than in previous conflicts, where you might have just gone the once, or you earned points and you were sent home. Right, the length might have been extended in World War II, but for the most part, it was just a one deployment. And then when you had reached your points, you were able to come home. Whereas our most recent conflicts, we were using the same small military over and over again. And the reason I point that out is it doesn't just have an impact on the service member who's deploying, but it also has an impact on the family, right? So that family is having to say goodbye to their loved one over and over again. And that loved one that service member is much more likely to experience a service-connected disability or injury because of going multiple times and being used over and over. So there is a truth, right, to that some of the worst wounds are those that go unseen. The suicide rate amongst veterans happened to be 22 a day in recent history, and that number, is obviously too high. 17 is too high. The VA has done a lot to work on providing additional resources. So that number has come down, but the population who is likely to commit suicide at this point, that age is 18 to 34. That has increased significantly. The original 22 a day, that population was actually a lot of Vietnam era veterans, again, who, were retiring, their lifestyle, things were changing, and as they were getting older, some of the things that they had not dealt with from returning from Vietnam were coming back. So the number is too high, right? But it's different generations of veterans who, and for different reasons, I think, where this rate is where it's at. There's also traumatic brain injuries. So because of the increased protection and armor, service members were experienced because of roadside bombs being essentially shaken in their vehicles and more likely to have sustained a traumatic brain injury. So I do have another poll. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit, Margaret, but if you could put that third poll up, I'd like to ask the group, how many service members or veterans do you think have post-traumatic stress disorder? So, right, the biggest ones, it's relatively split evenly, except for the about 26 to 50% is where we're at, right? So in a major study of 60,000 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, it was 13.5% who deployed and non-deployed veterans were screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, other studies have the rate going up to 20, some go up to 30. It really just depends. We also find a big difference depending on the conflict the veteran is a veteran of, right? So Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, the average is what we're seeing according to the VA is 11 to 20%. And then the larger population, Vietnam veterans, anywhere from 15 to 30. Now, those are relatively low numbers. However, the perception, if we think back to those headlines and what I was discussing about movies, the perception for most civilians who, again, no connection to the military. In 2016, Military Times found that 40% of civilians who participated in a study that they had believed that half of post 9/11 veterans had PTSD. The reason I share that with you is veterans and service members are aware that civilians have this perception of them. And I say that because if a veteran or a service member thinks that someone automatically is going to assume that they have post-traumatic stress disorder, and that is often linked to violence or irrational behavior or dangerous behavior, you're not going to want to disclose your military affiliation because of what someone might think of you. And that's what recent scholarship has shown, is that there's a lack of disclosure because PTSD from wartime service evoked perceptions of dangerousness and incompetence, right? And that the condition also led to levels of social exclusion. From a 2018 article in New York Times Magazine, I appreciate this quote: "I keep my PTSD to myself for the most part because people seem to clam up when I let it out. What people don't realize is that most of us are dealing with PTSD pretty well, even if sometimes takes drugs and therapy to get by." So it's how we view PTSD, and that type of view of it makes service members and veterans and even their family not want to disclose that someone is diagnosed with it. This is most recent in 2019, according to the VA. Now, service connected means that individuals who are connected based off of an injury an injury that came from military service. As you can see, post-traumatic stress is number 3 up there, and that's a little misleading because if you look at all of the ones underneath, a lot of them have to do with musculoskeletal, right? And if you kind of look at that injury in comparison, those are much more common. And then the most common service-connected injury are tinnitus and hearing loss. Now, as of 2019, 41% of post 9/11 veterans, and again, that's veterans who have served since 9/11 in 2001, had a service-connected disability rating with the VA. Now, that's 41% compared to 25% from previous generations. If we go back, remember, if you're a post 9/11 veteran, you're much more likely to have sustained a service-connected disability. It's a much smaller population being used over and over. So what we find in research that's been conducted in the last decade across universities is that military affiliated students often viewed that their campus community, faculty, staff, and other students did not appreciate, understand, or respect their military service. And this led to a feeling of isolation and alienation on campuses. And we've kind of seen why that could happen and where it comes from, right? If you're not related to someone who served in the military, and traditional college age students are less likely than staff and faculty. So you're not relating to your peers. It's unlikely that your peers have served. It means that you're very disconnected, right? There's a large military civilian knowledge gap between traditional students and military affiliated students. So we're going to do a little military 101, just some basics. So there are 6 branches of the military. Up till recently, there were 5, the newest being the Space Force. Every branch has its own term for its service members. So I was in the Army for 5 years, so I was a soldier, right? Soldier is what we throw around a lot to describe those in the military, but it only applies to those who have served in the Army. The Army is the biggest branch, so it's common, but still, a Marine definitely does not want to be called a soldier. So for Navy, it's sailor, right? Air Force, airman, the Space Force, guardian, and the Coast Guard, Coast Guardsman. Now, all but the Coast Guard fall under the Department of Defense. The Coast Guard falls under Homeland Security. That does not mean that it's not a part of the military, it's just it falls under a different department. The Navy and the Marine Corps both fall under the Department of the Navy, and the Space Force falls under the Department of the Air Force. But again, they're separate branches just under the same department. Now, the word dependent can seem possibly derogatory, but it's often used within military culture for those spouses or dependent children of service members. The VA uses it as well. So it's a term that we use a lot when we're describing the direct relatives, right? A dependent spouse or child of a veteran or service member. There are over 800 different types of jobs in the military. In my own research, and research has been conducted nationally, what we find is that students talk about, military affiliated students feel that they're always viewed as, oh, you're infantry, or you flew something, or, there's misconception about the different roles that you can have in the military. And most roles fall under 3 main categories. They're either combat, which would be infantry, which is something familiar from movies and everything, combat support, which is what I did. I was a engineer. I was in the combat engineer unit. Even though women at the time I was in were restricted from serving in combat roles, I served in the 94th Engineer Combat Battalion Heavy, which was combat support, right? So I was a carpentry masonry specialist. There's also support positions. Those are clerical positions. If a job exists in the civilian world, it's likely it also exists in the military. I'm going to steal this from Margaret, actually, because she just gave me this one. I never thought about it before, but it's a great description. Think of a hospital, right? The hospital isn't just staffed with doctors and nurses and physical therapists, right? The hospital is also staffed with human resources and cooks. You need other people to make that function. And the same thing is with the military. There's different people who do different jobs in the military, from clerical to combat related. And there's two different roles, right? This is just one branch, but it's showing, deployment versus, in the Army, we call this garrison. These are for service members who are service members 24/7. They're doing regular jobs, right? On a base, on a port, possibly on a ship, right? It's very different than compared to deployment activities. Component. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I served in the Army for 5 years. 2 of which were in the reserves and 3 of which were active duty. So active duty, every branch has an active duty component. That means someone serving active duty, that's what they do 24/7, that's their job, right? That's their full-time job. Now reserve and National Guard, that is 1 weekend a month, often 2 weeks over the summer to do additional training, but all of the components can deploy. Right. And the reason I make sure that the components are, you're aware of the components. If you think National Guard specifically, there's only National Guard Army and the Air National Guard. Now, if you remember during COVID when there were testing sites and those individuals who were helping with vaccine distribution, if you saw someone in uniform in the state, it's likely that they're the National Guard, right? The National Guard falls under the governor. So they're the ones who get called up during natural disasters or states of emergency within a state. If you remember Hurricane Sandy, it was a National Guard is who you likely saw. That doesn't mean, though, that the reserves and National Guard don't get activated to serve overseas or even in other states to help if there's a natural disaster. We have National Guard members who are activated over the last 2 years or 3 years, not just to assist with COVID response, but to serve in to protect against domestic violence, domestic terrorism, and to also serve down in Florida to help with hurricane relief. So reserve and National Guard, if they're activated and then they deploy, however long a period of time, those individuals often have civilian jobs that they're leaving, right? And also civilian families. Now, when you're active duty and you get activated, you have your community because you're on a base together. Everyone in your unit is usually going. So family have that support already built in. Whereas the Reserve and National Guard might not have that support. You could serve in a National Guard or Reserve unit that is 5 hours from where you live, right? Could be in a different state even. So I want you to think about that. So if you do know a National Guard member or reservist who is deployed, think about their family and the impact on them. So rank, I'm not going to go over all of this, but there's different ranks in the military. We have officers, you have warrant officers, and you have enlisted. Now, if you think about who and what responsibility each have, for the most part, enlisted, members of the service, they're responsible for completing missions and carrying out orders. Officers can be considered like the management, right, who are putting together the missions and the scope of the mission. And warrant officers are highly trained experts in specific areas. So if you think a helicopter pilot could be a warrant officer. So all branches, except for the Air Force and the Space Force, have warrant officers. To be an officer in the military, you have to have a college degree. World War II, you see some of those movies where someone's getting commissioned on the field. That doesn't really happen anymore. So officers can become officers in 2 different ways. After they've finished their college degree, they can go to a military academy like West Point, which is an elite Ivy school institution, or they can do Reserve Officer Training Corps. Rutgers, New Brunswick has every branch, right? We have Army, Air Force, and Navy ROTC. And if you remember the Department of the Navy for the Marine Corps, so in the Department of the Air Force for the Space Guard. So we have all of the ROTC branches covered. The ROTC program was designed to make the officer pool more reflective of the general population. So who is a veteran? Compared to generations of veterans that have come before, more diverse in gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Again, if you think back, far back to World War II, the military, right, women, there was a cap on women in the service until 1972 of 3%. They were also served in auxiliary roles, and there were very few roles in the military they could hold. Also, the military was segregated during World War II. So that makes sense that the current generation of service members and veterans are more diverse gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Current service members and veterans, post 9/11 veterans, are more likely to have sustained an injury. They're more likely to live under the poverty level than previous generations. They're more likely to have a high school diploma and less likely to have a college degree. And it's also important to remember that they are all volunteer force. Right, the draft hasn't existed since the early 70s, so everyone who's in the military who has served, in recent history, volunteered to serve. Who's a student veteran? On average, nationally, average age for a student veteran is 33. They're more likely than traditional students to be a first-generation college student. Nationally, that's about 69% of military-affiliated students, student veterans, are first generation. They're likely work full or part-time while they're pursuing their degree. They're likely married or have children. And education benefits are often cited as the main reason for joining the military. But I also talked about service members, I've talked about dependents, and I've talked about ROTC. So that it's important to look at the military affiliated population as diverse as it is, and their needs are different, right? So service member, the average age at Rutgers is 27 of our current students who are currently serving. For ROTC, their average age is 21. And for dependents, the average age is 24. So again, military affiliated is what I'll usually revert back to, because every population is different and it depends on who we're talking about. Since we serve more than just student veterans, half our population, military affiliated students, are current service members or the dependents of veterans. So it's important to have an inclusive term. So who are we talking about? When I say military affiliated students, and other locations often say military connected students, either works. Those are veterans, service members, dependents, or students enrolled in ROTC. That's how we define military affiliated students. Transitioning. So a mission brings purpose. A service member's rank and job provide a place in the hierarchy. Their squad, unit, company, squadron, fleet, etc. provides camaraderie, and shared hardship reinforces that bond. Now that's a big transition from the military culture to the civilian culture. And again, it can be for not just those who served or currently serving, but their family as well, right? The military should be looked at as a culture, as you would look at a culture of another country. It has its own language, it has its own customs and norms and way of dress. All of those things, even for the family, make a difference on how they live their life and how they interact with each other. So to transition from that to something civilian, like a college campus, can be jarring. Any transition can be jarring. There are positive impacts that those who have served, veterans or service member, have gotten from the military. In polling, they found 74% of veterans who served on active duty after 9/11 reported their service helped them get ahead in life. 93% reported it helped them mature. 90% reported it taught them how to work with others, and 90% reported it helped them build self-confidence. Now, I like to give myself as an example. I had gone to college at 18, like most of my friends, and I was not a good student. I could make it to a party, but I could not make it to an 8 a.m. class. And I left college with a 1.7 GPA. I joined the military. I joined before 9/11. I finished basic training 2 days after 9/11 happened. So I joined during peacetime as a reservist, but I did it because I thought I needed a little bit of discipline, and that's why I joined. But it made a huge difference in my life. For me, after I got out of the military, I went back to college, and I went from that 1.7 to double majoring in things that I wasn't even majoring in before. The 4 years I spent on making friends the first time around. Double majored, double minored, was on the dean's list, and have since gone on for 2 graduate degrees. It made a difference in my life. I'm not saying that's the way it is for everyone, but it helped me mature. It put me on the right path. And for a lot of our students, they did it for similar reasons, to access education benefits, and to give themselves an advantage. But of course, as I've mentioned, there are also negative impacts of military service. I have service-connected disabilities that I have to deal with every day. I see students who have service-connected disabilities that also impact them every day. 42% of post 9/11 veterans reported difficulty readjusting to civilian life, compared to 17% of previous generations of veterans. In part, some of that does have to do with the multiple deployments. It's hard to adjust when you're always getting ready for a possible an additional deployment. I hadn't even been back. I was based out of Germany. I had just gotten back from my first deployment, and we were already on orders to deploy again. So the year between my deployment, which wasn't even a year, it was a 363 days. I was just prepping for that next deployment. And I think it's important to know that for post 9/11 veterans, possibly the discrepancy in this difference of adjustment has to do with those multiple deployments. 35% of veterans reported knowing or serving with someone who was seriously injured or killed in action. Now, again, multiple deployments and a smaller number of people serving means that's a reality of current conflicts in combat for service members. Now, those readjustment issues, some do lead to post-traumatic stress, and there's additional challenges. Those who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress have struggle with financial issues, getting medical care for themselves or their family, and a lot struggle with alcohol or drug abuse. So service members, veterans, even families have been polled about what stops a service member or veteran from getting help. And the top 5 barriers to care are often that medications may have too many side effects. It could harm my career, could be denied a security clearance. Family or friends would be more helpful than a mental health professional, and coworkers and classmates would have less confidence in me. But really the biggest barrier to care is stigma. As we went over before, there is, veterans and service members and their family are aware that the opinion of those who have no military connection is often that veterans are very, maybe heroes, right? Very polarized, extreme aspects, could be very violent, have mental health disorder. Those things make veterans and service members and even their families less likely to disclose based off of any stigmas associated with those things. So military affiliated students at Rutgers. And this is our mission statement, but I really wanted to focus in on, promoting well-being and helping our military affiliated students transition. That's our goal, not just transition successfully into higher education at Rutgers, but also out of Rutgers professionally. It's the transition we know that is the hardest. And we want to make sure that we see our military affiliated population as a very diverse population with different needs, and meeting those needs of everyone. You can't, veterans or service members, we're not a monolith, right? We don't have the same backgrounds, we don't come from the same places, and we have different needs. And Rutgers is dedicated to making sure we address all of that. We happen to be a vet success campus. It's one of over 120 now, but it originally, just about 2 years ago, was only 69 in the country. That means we actually have a vocational rehabilitation counselor staffed with us at least once a week. COVID has changed this. We used to have them 4 times a week pre-COVID, and we're building that back up. But it's really valuable to have a VA employee who works right out of our office, who we can, check up on our students. They can get answers much quicker than calling on their own. So this is open to anyone who is interested or needs any type of counseling about the VA. So Yvonne Nelson, I'll be happy to share that contact information, but she's accessible to give advice or point someone in the right direction. We're a first stop shop. That's how we refer to ourselves. There are a lot of veteran or military support organizations out there that try to be a one-stop shop. Now, we want our students transitioning into higher education and recognizing that they're different and their needs are different. We want them to utilize everything Rutgers has for them, all the opportunities, which means that we shouldn't be a one-stop shop. We should be a first-stop shop. We want them to come to us first so we can help them in that transition piece, but we want to make sure that they see a counselor, an academic advisor with the school that they're in. If they need to see someone at disability services or counseling, that they go to those offices. That doesn't mean that we don't bring services into our office. We have in-house and virtual services. For academic advising, the 3 schools I have listed here are the ones where the bulk of our population happen to be in New Brunswick. So the School of Arts and Science, School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, and the School of Engineering. Now for Newark, actually the largest major and enrollment is really in business. So it just depends on which location you're at. In New Brunswick, we offer tutoring services, disability service counselors, veterans benefits team. That means it could be someone from the state or from the VA itself. Career exploration and success does office hours. We keep one office completely empty at Veterans House in New Brunswick to have these type of services rotating through. And as you see, the last one, business school manager of military and veteran engagement programs. So Margaret is often a fixture at Veterans House in New Brunswick. Now ranking, so best for vets, according to Military Times, Rutgers has been ranked in the top 15 schools of 4-year colleges for veterans for the last 12 years. There's no other school who can say that. What we do is we're passionate about it. Most of the people who work with military affiliated students at Rutgers and across Rutgers are veterans themselves or dependents. Rutgers University New Brunswick ranks 7th in the nation, according to College Factual, best for veterans. And Rutgers University Camden recently was named a Purple Heart University for its veteran services, the first New Jersey university to earn this distinction. We have a voice nationally. Senator Booker years ago actually came and participated in a roundtable with Rutgers students and crafted legislation that he proposed based off of that conversation. So we have that voice. We support our military affiliated students in different ways, encouraging them to participate in different organizations on campus, sending them to conferences, recognizing that our military affiliated students are more likely to have children. So hosting events where we include them and allow them to bring family. We also have different organizations in Rutgers that serve military affiliated students. We're one of 2 institutions that have a STEM veterans specific club. We have our Student Veterans of America chapter. On each campus, there's a chapter. Rutgers Veterans Recreation Series, recognizing that recreation brings students together and fosters community. So we have a pretty robust recreation series. And ROTC, actually, women within ROTC started the Rutgers Society of Service Women. Military affiliated students often get priority registration or early registration to make sure that they have a limited set of benefits to use when they're pursuing higher education. We want to make sure that they don't run out of benefits before they get to their goal. Our recreation series is probably the most well-attended and popular events that we do. We've been doing it for quite a few years. COVID did put a damper on some of these events. The golf series has been the largest part of these. We look at the golf series as not only a recreation event, but also professional development. We also make sure we connect our students to additional support, making sure that we work directly with community-based organizations that serve veterans and service members, to include the VA or the state. And we make sure that we represent the diversity of the military affiliated population. So we have currently students who are serving overseas as well. military affiliated students or dependents who are taking on additional responsibility because of a loved one being deployed. So it's always good to keep those students in your mind. So very quickly, I want to leave time for questions. So I think we're on track to do that. I wanted to do a do say and don't say. Don't say, are you a veteran? Veteran's a legal term. It means that you served on active duty, but it really is depending on how someone sees themselves. My father enlisted in the Navy during Vietnam, but got put on a ship in the Atlantic. He never went to Indonesia. So he's not a combat veteran. So for a long time, if you asked him if he was a veteran, he would say no, because he wasn't a combat veteran. If you want to ask a question, it's better to say, have you served in the military? Right? Because then you're able to ask follow-up questions and get more information. But someone might not see themselves as a veteran or meet the definition of veteran. So asking, have you served in the military, is a much better way to do that. So don't say, oh, so you were a soldier, right? Again, a Marine would definitely not want to be called a soldier. It depends on the branch of service. That's, based on what you would be called. So you ask, what branch were you in, right? And that'll tell you what term to call them. Saying service member is a blanket term for everyone in the service. So don't say, were you in the war? That's a very personal experience. People don't generally get to decide whether they're deploying or not. I deployed twice to Iraq before my brother, who had been in the Army 5 years before me, even deployed once. That wasn't a choice on his part or mine. That was just where we were and the orders we came under. So it's better to say, what did you do in the service, or where were you stationed? Asking those questions are going to get you again to an answer that might tell you, like, well, I was stationed out of Germany, but I deployed twice to Iraq. So I'm going to answer that question for you based off of that. So it's okay to ask respectful questions, and it's okay if someone doesn't want to answer. So I wanted to now leave this open for any questions that the audience might have. I see that there are some in the chat. I'm sorry I didn't.
Oh, no worries, Dan. I have the Q&A open, so I'll start with a reminder to everyone that if you submit a question to the Q&A box, it's easiest for me to find it to pose to Anne, and you can do that as things come to mind. I know I have a few questions for you, but I'd like to pose the audience question that came in to you first. So this is about something I happen to know, since I know you well, that you are familiar with, which was the Senate bill on burn pits. And we have someone in our audience who is actually studying the role of brain cancer in veterans, and wanted to know your opinion about that burn pit legislation.
Right. And it's not even just cancer exposure, but I actually was exposed to burn pits twice during my deployments. And when I got out of the military, when I went to register for VA healthcare, I was put into a group that they monitored. And I do have people I served with who have cancer that is likely related to burn pits. I'm actually, impressed in it feels good that it was recognized so quickly, in a sense. In the same vein, Congress is also just responding to some of Vietnam era veterans who who were exposed to toxins during their service. That took a much longer time to get through. And you think about veterans who have passed since, who weren't getting the additional support that they were due because of those exposures. So, I'm happy that it happened. I think the ability of a country to even actually recruit for the military has a lot to do with how they treat those who have already served. So I think them passing this bill and it being signed into law is reflective of, a nation that's grateful for military service. I'm happy to provide a copy of the slides. I just have to make them a PDF, and I'll make sure I do that, and I will provide it to Margaret.
Oh, we actually are recording the entire presentation, so everyone will get a chance to see them, but we can, if that's okay with you, and we can make that an attachment in our follow-up email.
Absolutely.
Oh, great. All right. Well, while our audience is coming up with additional questions to pose to you, I have a couple. One was, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about jargon, things that are used in the military or things that are used by civilians that people in the military don't understand.
True, and I have a slide that I did take out for this presentation because sometimes that can go over. So the military does speak a lot of jargon, and some of those things stick. I haven't been in the military since 2006. Yet when I'm in the office, we will still say things like chow hall or DFAC, which is what we would call a dining facility, right, in the military, and we know what we're talking about. So the military does speak in a lot of acronyms, which isn't as strange, especially that at Rutgers, we use acronyms all the time. And it probably wouldn't surprise you that the acronyms we use over a course of time, you stop for remembering what they even mean. All right. So, when we refer to PCS, someone says, oh, I'm PCSing, they're going from one duty station to another. I would have to look up what PCS stands for. I know when a service member or veteran says it to me, what they mean. But the actual words that it stands for, it slipped. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, we say PTSD. An old one that I'm a fan of is scuttlebutt, which is a Civil War term, but it means gossip. But veterans or service members are likely to speak in these acronyms, and it's better to ask what they mean than to make an assumption based off something you've heard. Years and years ago, I was at a conference where people were presenting to folks who do what I do, who work with military affiliated students in higher education, and an organization had a name that in the military translates into something that's negative and derogatory. And if they had known that, I'm sure that that's not the name that they would have gone with, or they would have made a joke about it or addressed it. So it was very off-putting to the audience. So it's important when you don't understand the jargon that someone might be using, it's okay to just ask, what does that mean? Rather than using it inappropriately or assuming you know what it means.
And I've got you on PCS.
Yes. Oh, you looked it up?
Oh,
Okay.
I knew it.
Oh.
I knew that one. Permanent change of station.
Yeah.
Actually, I think someone who serves a little bit as a translator is someone like a dependent, like I was, a military spouse, because they had to know both sides. You can't go and tell your family you're PCSing. You have to explain to them what that means.
Makes perfect sense, right?
Yes.
And then you just shorten it to be very direct, right?
Yes, exactly. So my next question for you was about the size of our forces. You talked about that it was, we're dealing with a smaller military now, and that's causing the same people to deploy many more times. But I was thinking about it and I realized I don't think that we've had, and also you mentioned such a long period of sustained warfare. These are the only two periods of warfare that didn't incorporate a draft.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So
Yeah.
we're an all volunteer force. I actually like to think that my first deployment, I did meet a command sergeant major. That's one of the highest enlisted ranks someone could have, who had been drafted during Vietnam. And he told us directly that he believed he was probably the last person who was still in the military who had been drafted. Right, because he'd been drafted at the tail end of Vietnam, and this is early on in 2003 when I was in Iraq. So he was someone who was probably very, very close to retirement. But that makes a difference, right? So everyone who's in the military now, volunteered to be there.
Yeah,
And I go ahead. I'm sorry.
That makes a difference, I think, with the size, with the fact that less people feel engaged or less people know someone because it's such a small fighting force.
Exactly. You're right.
Yeah. And I have another question for you, which is that we talked about some campus experiences and things like that, and I'm wondering if you can make a parallel to any recommendations you could make to anyone who's not thinking from a campus perspective, but maybe from an employer perspective about what things can be better in terms of cultural understanding and experiences that they could have for their military affiliated employees.
Absolutely. I spend a good chunk, in the beginning just talking about very few serve, right? Very few are related directly to someone serves. And even the ones who are related, whether you got an understanding. Like if you're saying, oh, it was my grandpa, but, didn't tell me a lot about their experience, or parent, but, I was born after they served, so you don't necessarily know a lot about their experiences. That means that we get our understanding from other places, and that's mostly from the media. And if the media has a more sensationalized view of the military and military service, again, like whether it's incredibly violent, those who serve are very violent, or they're broken, or they're, heroes. Like I could tell you, I've never run into a burning building to save kittens, something along those lines, right? But if you're going to see me as that, right, not just as a person, like I'm less likely to divulge it. And if I do divulge it, let's say I'm going on an interview, some of those unconscious bias that we have because we think either violent, veteran, maybe rigid, as we saw in the polling. There's research out there that shows that hiring professionals have unconscious bias that impacts hiring of veterans and service members, because they think they're going to be too rigid. They think they're going to be difficult to work with, because of the fear that they might be prone to violence. So we're in career services, right? We tell our students, absolutely put your military service down on your resume. I was a carpentry masonry specialist, and I still have my military service down on my CV. Not because it has anything to do with what I currently do, other than the being in the service, but not my actual role. But because there are other things that came from the military: leadership, teamwork, being responsible for, millions of dollars worth of equipment and mission completion, right? Those things are important selling points. But for someone who has no connection to the military, no service themselves, and no direct relationship where they really were exposed to those things, if you see a bunch of headlines that talk about veterans being violent, that's not someone you might want to hire, right? You don't want to openly say it, but those headlines make a difference in how we view the population. So I would say the cultural competency, the military cultural competency of hiring professionals, recruiters, is really important.
I agree. And I think one other thing that companies can do to parallel some of the programs and activities that we think of as happening on campus is to have an employee resource group. And it can be
Exactly.
populated with both, not both, because I'm going to go with, I think, 3 categories here, but service members, and that incorporates all the service members that you described, but especially so guard and reservists, because as you mentioned, they usually have full-time civilian jobs outside of their military service. But
Mm-hmm.
then the dependents, the military spouses, children, and so forth, and then allies.
Right.
We found that the veteran employee resource groups that we have worked with and supported through Rutgers Business School have identified, in some cases, even sometimes more than 50% of the people are what we consider allies. They're
Mm-hmm.
not a direct relative. They're not a service member themselves. They're just crazy, stupid supportive of the military and veteran population. So
Right.
that's something that we can definitely talk to anyone who's here today or listening afterward about, for sure. But we've reached almost the end of our time, and I have a few closing remarks, if that's okay.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
uh, but I guess we'll start my closing remarks with a big thank you, and for a great job, great presentation, and for our audience for having some questions and participating in our polls. That definitely helped form the basis of the discussion. So before we close, I wanted to let you know that RBS webinars have moved. You should now watch for our monthly webinars to take place on Fridays at noon Eastern time. And for more information, you can always visit our webpage. You can see it here on our site, but it is business.rutgers.edu/alumni/lifelong-learning. And that will be emailed to all of the registrants. And as I said, it appears on the screen for anyone who happens to be watching this as a recording. And we have an exciting schedule of topics and presenters lined up. and they come from great suggestions from our audience. So we encourage you to keep sharing your ideas with us. We want our series to continue to meet your needs. So please stay online for just a moment longer as today's webinar ends, because you'll immediately see a very brief 3-question survey about today's event. And one of them is a free form field that you can type in subjects and/or speakers you'd like to have featured in future webinars. Finally, as I mentioned when our webinar began earlier, a link to the archived recording of this presentation will be shared via social media and emailed to you, and will also be on the Business Insights page of our website, along with the recordings of our previous virtual lunch and learns. So thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. And before we go, if you would like to see if your military cultural competency changed in any way, you can scan this QR code and see how your results differ from the time you took it at the very beginning of today's session. So I thank you again, Anne. I thank you, our audience, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye for now.